everybody who views this video, I send greetings and felicitations. I'm Mark Hempsell and I am what is generally but somewhat inaccurately called a rocket scientist. However, if I were to be pedantic, and I am, I should be described as an astronautical system engineer. Now you may be wondering what makes me an astronautical system engineer. And so to illustrate the point and establish my credentials, here are some of the space systems that I've worked on in my career, including communication satellites, launch vehicles, space infrastructure system proposals, and in more recent days the Skylon space plane and other advanced concepts like the Scorpion that you saw in the title sequence. In addition to involvement in real space projects in industry, I've also taught systems engineering at the University of Bristol. And when the pandemic hit in 2020 and we were all legally confined to our homes, one of the consequences was that my students were unable to experience my awesome personality direct, and this meant that my lectures had to be recorded on video. And so, long story, I got the cameras, the microphones, the editing software, the lights, even a clapperboard, and turned into a video producer. So we're now back to normality, and I thought it might be an idea to exploit my newfound content creator skills and start a YouTube channel. Now, we need to decide what sort of YouTube channel it is going to be. Now, as you can see from my DVD collection here, I'm rather partial to a good film, and in particular a good space film. So a channel dedicated in some way to space movies would seem to be an obvious choice. Now, I would love to convince you that my DVDs have always been arranged in this organised manner, but in truth this display has been created especially for this channel. Indeed, many books lost their home to bring us this display. So, my beauties have never been this organised before, and one result of this exercise is that I've discovered that my copy of Guardians of the Galaxy has either escaped to someone else's collection or it was stored too close to the Harry Potter series and has been transfigured into a second copy of Madagascar, Escape to Africa. One of life's irresolvable mysteries. My first thought was maybe a film reaction channel. They seem very easy to do, they seem very popular, but there are a few problems with this idea. The first problem is that, as you can see from my collection here, it contains most of the films that a gentleman of discernment and taste should have seen. So, convincing you that I've seen a popular film for the first time is likely to be beyond even my considerable powers of deception. There is another problem, and that is that I am unwilling to waste a couple of my remaining hours on this planet watching some random awful movie just because some joker on Patreon has slipped me $10 for a laugh. And if I'm going to see a great movie for the first time, after the studio has spent tens to hundreds of millions of dollars to create a visual feast, then it should be seen here, in the cinema, on a large screen, with a good sound system, rather than on a phone or a laptop with something stuck in your ear. And if you watch films in the cinema as God and the producers intended, I've discovered that the staff at Cineworld are a little uptight about members of the audience setting up video recording equipment during a screening. My local cinema, which coincidentally is literally over the fence from Britain's largest spacecraft factory, is also very close to the police station and the magistrates' court who deal with such matters. But looking at the number of subscription and the watch figures on YouTube reacted channels, it is very tempting. And so I did do some test footage before I finally gave up on the idea. Now, we already have the cliched bookcase background, and of course we also need a guitar in the background, and just to make sure the microphone is in shot, just to highlight the amateur nature of the production. And there we are, all set up, ready to go.
Oh!
think we can all agree, definitely not. So, we're on to plan B, which is to do no spoiler reviews of science fiction movies. But not just any old science fiction movies, only those that take place in space. And who will decide what qualifies as a space film? Well, me, of course, but do feel free to make suggestions of your own for me to consider. My criteria will be, does it contribute to our society's perception of space? Because that's my underlying thesis in all this. I will be arguing that our cultural perception of space and space flight comes from space movies, not from space in reality. And it's not just the public perception, but the perception of politicians and other decision makers, and even the space industry itself. So I will be giving my opinion on the films as pieces of entertainment. And while some are works of torture comparable only to Vogon poetry, there are many others that are justly famous, and then there are also many forgotten gems that are very good as works of art and well worth a watch, even if in every case they are not realistic depictions of the reality of space and space flight. And I do mean every case. Yes, even this one, and this one, and this one. So I shall be unreservedly trashing with gusto all of these space-based films for their inaccuracies, regardless of any artistic merit they may or may not have. So, where to start this exploration of space films? Well, the first film set in space would seem to be a good idea, and that would be Georges Méliès' Voyage dans la Lune. Now, Monsieur Méliès was French, but that wasn't his fault, and there's nothing we can do about it. He made this seminal work in Paris in 1902, a year before the Wright brothers' first flight in a powered aircraft. Now, being a silent film, its inherent Frenchness is not a bar to enjoyment by those of us who do not suffer from knowledge of the French language, and thus it was accessible to a global audience, and Méliès was fully aware of this potential market. Even though 1902 is just 6 or 7 years after the first ever public showing of moving pictures, Méliès' genius was to be the first to understand the potential of film as a global mass medium. And so Voyage dans la Lune is of interest because it's not just the first space film, it's the first blockbuster movie, in that it was aimed at an international market, it was very long, around a quarter of an hour. It's effects laden with a fast-paced popularist plot, it was expensive to produce. The production budget was 10,000 francs. As a result, it's widely regarded as a highly influential film of great importance in the history of cinema. And I'm going to guess that even if you think you've never heard of it or seen it, there is one meme that I am sure you will have come across. As we have seen, 1902 is less than a decade since moving films have become a medium of popular entertainment. But what audiences were being offered was pretty simple fare. This is a typical example. It was taken by Mitchell and Kenyon, who were British film pioneers. And in most of the films, they simply did a shot taken in the town of the audience, normally the previous day, and then people would turn up to see themselves on film. And this was emphasised in their sales slogans, such as local films for local people and see yourselves as others see you. And although they also made news reenactments and short comedies, all of these were little more than sophisticated home movies. This parochial outlook was effectively blown away by Méliès' vision of high-quality films aimed at a global market, and by 1910, Mitchell and Kenyon's business had faded away. So Méliès' high production value film would have a spectacular impact. Of course, after a century of developing taste and sophistication in audiences, today we would not swallow this childish presentation. And no current filmmaker would resort to such unsubtle and crude crowd pleasers as women in an operational environment wearing uniforms whose sole purpose is to show off their legs, or more generally, women in gratuitous states of undress. And we wouldn't have stereotypical science engineering characters with completely unrealistic levels of knowledge and expertise, nor get away with aliens who are clearly just actors in crude, cheap and very unconvincing costumes, nor have spacecraft making spectacular escapes that defy the laws of physics and rationality and believability. And I'm sure that as modern educated sophisticates, you would not need me to point out that this film is hardly a realistic depiction of spaceflight. But I'm not sure that it was ever intended to be seen as such. Even in 1902, this would be seen as unrealistic. Méliès understood that a blockbuster movie needs to have variety of dramatic tone, fast-paced action and spectacular visuals if the audience are to remain entranced for the whole 15 minutes. And injecting realism into all this would be completely counter. So it was always meant to be a fantasy. And this is reinforced when you look at the film's source. The title, Voyage dans la Lune, comes from an operetta by Offenbach, which had premiered in Paris a quarter of a century earlier. The problem was that this operetta was perceived as being based on Jules Verne's novel From the Earth to the Moon, and that had been published some 3 years earlier. Now, Monsieur Verne felt obliged to point out this potential copyright infringement to Monsieur Offenbach, and some unrecorded settlement was reached. No doubt learning from this, Méliès openly credited his inspiration as the by now 2 novels from Jules Verne, From Earth to the Moon, published in 1865, and its sequel, Around the Moon, published 5 years later. It's always a good idea to tie your blockbuster film to a well-loved work in another medium. And also Jules Verne was still alive and might have noticed that once again his intellectual property was being half-inched. The point I would make here in support of my overall thesis is that Offenbach's operetta was categorised as opera féerie, that is, opera based on fairy tales. In hindsight, we applaud the early science fiction pioneers like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells for their science accuracy and remarkable visions of the future. And there is some evidence that both authors were proud of this attention to the matter. So it's probably how they would like to be remembered. But for the wider audience at the time, it was the fantasy element that inspired and stuck in their minds, and all that scientific accuracy stuff was just real pearls before fantasy-loving swine. Indeed, Verne's caution, sticking to where he felt safe from a realism point of view, caused a problem for both Offenbach and Méliès. The first novel never even gets into space, and even in the second novel, Verne never got his heroes onto the moon's surface. And let's face it, an audience wants a landing. So if Offenbach and Méliès wanted bums on seats, they'd better provide one, which they both duly did. Offenbach has a long story involving princesses, apples, volcanoes, social revolution, and lots of singing, taking 4 acts. And this is clearly not suitable for a 15-minute silent film. So Méliès opted for a short, simple story in which our heroes are captured by the lunar people, taken to the lunar king in a throne room, and then effecting an escape. Many discussions on this film, especially in English, point out that this simple plot has a more than passing resemblance to H.G. Wells' novel The First Men on the Moon, that had been published the previous year. But Méliès didn't acknowledge the similarity, maybe because, well, Wells was English and also to avoid any copyright issues. Of course, it may be that Méliès had not read Wells's novel. After all, it was new and in a foreign language, and we should also note that the plot is rather simple and obvious. And get used to it, as it's the basis of almost all space films before the Second World War and several after. We're going to see an awful lot of royal throne rooms in later movies. While to our modern eyes, this movie looks rather makeshift and amateur, It was in fact the production of a large commercial enterprise. This was shown by the HBO miniseries From Earth to Moon featuring Tom Hanks, which did an excellent full-scale reconstruction of the studio and the production of the film itself. It shows how all the scenes were acted out on a theatre-like stage which was lit from above by a glass roof with one camera situated where the audience would be. The HBO drama also shows that Melies was not a space enthusiast with a missionary zeal, but rather a showman trying to make the most spectacular show he could. But there's one shot which I think he was attempting a realistic image to take the audience into space, and I'd like to explore that a little. It is where the Earth is shown rising above the surface of the Moon, an image that emphasises that we're no longer on Earth's globe but in space looking down on it. It echoes an effect that was used by Offenbach to close out his operetta, and Melies probably felt the audience would be expecting to see it. And it is a powerful image, which was proven when mankind saw an Earthrise for real on the Apollo missions. This had an immense impact on our culture's perception of space and Earth. But this is seen from orbit. On the Moon's surface, the Earth never rises or sets. The Moon famously always points the same face to the Earth. So while on Earth we see the Moon rise and set as the Earth spins around, on the Moon the Earth always seems to be in exactly the same place in the sky. Well, actually, it wobbles around a very small amount. Well, we can perhaps forgive Melies for not realising this. What's more surprising is that in the very episode of Tom Hanks's From Earth to Moon that features the making of Voyage à la Lune, it repeats this mistake in a scene that is presumably attempting to echo the 1920 film it is paying homage to. But remember, this is a historical docudrama that is emphasising its accuracy. We're going to see this again and again. Inaccurate tropes established in early films through a combination of ignorance and a desire for crowd-pleasing effect that are then repeated in later films until a space genre has evolved which is set in this fairy space universe, and which we all take for realistic. Indeed, so ingrained is this fairy space perception of the universe that in the rare cases the genre assumptions are broken for realism, the effect on the audience's perception is the exact opposite. So what's the story of Melies' masterpiece? Well, the impact was everything he could have hoped for. It was a massive international hit. And the fact that 120 years later, images from the film still have a place in our culture speaks volumes for its artistic vision. But in a tragic turn of events, the movie industry not only discovered global blockbusters, it also discovered copyright piracy. While showing in London, the film was discreetly borrowed and multiple copies made. And it was soon showing all over America, making vast sums of money for people like Thomas Edison, but not a centime for George Méliès. And he goes without saying, this is not the outcome that he was hoping for. So, my final thought on Le Voyage à la Lune. Is it worth watching? Well, I would argue that despite the static cinematography, the crude effects and the very stagey overacting, it does merit 15 minutes of your time. Not because it shows anything about spaceflight, obviously it doesn't, nor as a gripping story, because by modern standards it isn't, but as the starting point for so much of modern cinema, it is a fascinating watch.